I used to believe I could control everything, until the night she looked back at me. They called me the Beast of Bath, a name whispered in the shadows of ballrooms I no longer frequented, a title earned through scars that ran far deeper than the jagged lines marking my jaw and shoulder. I had accepted my exile. I had embraced the darkness of my manor, a fortress of silence where the only rhythm was the ticking of clocks and the steady pour of scotch. I was a man who had forgotten the warmth of a sunbeam until Clara entered my house. She arrived not as a lady, but as a breath of life I didn't deserve. They called him the Beast of Bath, a man no lady dared to face. But when her trembling hand touched his scar, the monster the world feared began to disappear. I remember the first time I saw her. She was standing in the foyer, her modest traveling cloak damp from the Somerset rain. She wasn't a diamond of the first water. She was something more dangerous. She was real. Her eyes weren't filled with the pity or the revulsion I was accustomed to seeing in the eyes of the ton. Instead, there was a quiet, stubborn fire. I stood on the landing of the great staircase, half shrouded in the gloom, watching her. My heart, a cold organ I thought had long since turned to stone, gave a treacherous thud against my ribs. "You are late," I had growled, my voice raspy from years of disuse. I wanted to frighten her. I needed to frighten her, because if she didn't fear me, I knew I would be lost. She didn't flinch. She simply looked up, her gaze locking onto mine with a directness that felt like a physical blow. "The roads were washed out, my lord," she replied, her voice steady, melodic, and entirely too bold. "I am Clara, your new housekeeper." Housekeeper, a title too small for the storm she brought into my sterile world. In the weeks that followed, she became a ghost that haunted my waking hours. I would hear the soft rustle of her skirts in the hallway, the scent of lavender and soap lingering in the air long after she had passed. I found myself seeking her out, watching from the library door as she polished silver or directed the staff. She moved with a grace that was an affront to my own jagged edges. I hated how much I wanted to watch her. I hated how my skin would prickle when she entered a room. One evening, the tension finally snapped. I was in the library, the fire dying in the hearth, when she brought in a tray of tea. The light of the single candle she carried danced across her throat, highlighting the delicate pulse beating there. "Leave it," I snapped, not looking up from my book, though the words on the page were a blurred mess. "You haven't eaten all day, Arthur," she said softly. She used my name. No one had used my name in 3 years. I stood up so abruptly my chair scraped harshly against the floor. I stalked toward her, looming over her, letting the firelight reveal the full extent of my scars. I wanted to see her recoil. I wanted her to see the monster. "Do not presume to know my needs. Clara, you are here to manage the house, not its master." I was inches from her. I could smell the heat of her body. Instead of stepping back, she did the unthinkable. She reached out. Her fingers were trembling. Yes, but her touch was sure. She placed her hand against my scarred cheek, her palm warm against my cold, ruined skin. The air left my lungs. The world narrowed down to the point of contact between us. It was a soft, tentative pressure, yet it felt like a brand. I should have pulled away. I should have roared. But I was paralyzed by the sheer, agonizing sweetness of it. "There is no monster here," she whispered, her thumb brushing the edge of a scar. "Only a man who has stayed in the dark for too long." My hand shot up, grabbing her wrist. Not to hurt her, but because I was drowning and she was the only thing keeping me tethered to the earth. My thumb pressed into the soft underside of her wrist, feeling her heart racing, matching the frantic rhythm of my own. I saw her pupils dilate, her lips parting just a fraction. The provocation in her eyes was unintentional, but it was devastating. "You have no idea what you're doing," I groaned, my voice a low, dangerous vibration. "I am not a good man, Clara. I am a man of hungers you cannot possibly understand." "Then teach me," she challenged, her voice a mere breath against my lips. I let go of her wrist, but I didn't move away. I leaned closer until our foreheads touched. I could feel her breath on my skin, a warm invitation to a sin I had spent years trying to forget. The desire was a slow burn, a low ache in my loins that threatened to consume my every scrap of discipline. I wanted to taste her. I wanted to find out if she was as soft as she looked, or if that fire in her eyes translated to a heat that could finally melt the ice in my soul. "Go," I commanded, though it sounded more like a plea, "before I forget that I am a gentleman and you are under my protection." She looked at me for one long, agonizing second, her gaze searching mine, seeing the hunger I couldn't hide. Then, without a word, she turned and left, but the silence she left behind was no longer empty. It was thick with the ghost of a touch and the terrifying realization that the beast of Bath had finally found his hunter. And God help me, I wanted to be caught. The following morning brought a merciless rain, turning the Bath landscape into a gray blur of mist and stone. I had not slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the ghostly pressure of Clara's fingers against my scar. It was a new kind of torture, one that isolation had not prepared me for. I was the Duke of Ashworth, a man who once commanded regiments and seduced ladies with a smile that no longer existed. Now, I was merely a prisoner of my own rage, and that woman, she was the only one who dared to step through the bars of my cage. She was my maid, my duty, my sin. But as I watched her through the crack of the drawing-room door, I realized she would never be just a maid. Clara moved with a dignity that would shame any duchess in Park Lane. She was drawing back the heavy velvet curtains, letting the pale light of day spill in, revealing the dust and neglect of my life. My instinct was to bark at her to close them, to leave me in the shadows where I belonged. But the sight of her, bathed in that weak light, her chestnut hair pinned in a tight coil that exposed the nape of her neck, it paralyzed me. "The sun won't bite, my lord," she said, without turning around. I cursed it under my breath. "How did you know I was there?" She toned, a small, provocative smile playing on her lips. "You have a distinct scent, Arthur. Sandalwood, old paper, and a certain stubbornness." I stepped into the room, my boots echoing on the hardwood. "You are paid to clean, Clara, not to analyze my character." "One leads to the other," she replied, stepping closer with a duster in her hand. "It's hard to scrub the grime from a house when the master refuses to let the light in to see where it lies." She stopped in front of me. The air between us changed instantly. It became thick, charged with the memory of the previous night. I looked down at her, and for the first time I didn't see a servant. I saw a woman who looked at me as if she could see the boy I used to be, before the blood and the fire. "And what if I prefer the dirt, Clara?" I stepped closer, my shadow swallowing her small frame. "What if the darkness is the only place where I don't have to see what I become?" "Then you are a coward," she whispered. The word hung between us, sharp and impossible to ignore. "And I don't think you are a coward. I think you are a man who is terrified of feeling something other than pain." I reached out, my hand hovering near her waist before I caught myself. The urge to pull her against me, to silence her arrogance with a kiss that would shatter us both, was a physical ache. "You take liberties that no other servant would dare." "Perhaps that is because I don't see a beast," she said, her voice dropping to a low, melodic hum that vibrated in my chest. "I see a man who misses the touch of another human being so much it's killing him." I let out a harsh, broken laugh. "You think you can save me? I am ruined, Clara. My soul is as scarred as my face." "Then let me see them," she said suddenly. "What?" "The scars on your shoulder. Stop hiding from me." My breath hitched. I stood there, trembling, as she slowly, methodically reached for the buttons of my waistcoat. When she slid the heavy coat from my shoulders, I felt exposed, raw. She didn't gasp. She didn't look away. She reached out and traced the line of a scar that ran from my collarbone down toward my heart. Her touch sent a jolt of pure electricity through my veins. "I have been starving for years, Clara," I growled, grabbing her waist and pulling her flush against me. "And you look like a feast." "Then eat, Arthur," she whispered, her voice a ragged plea. "I'm not afraid of your hunger." I didn't kiss her. Not yet. I let my lips brush against the corner of her mouth, feeling the frantic heat of her breath. My thumb traced a line of her jaw, lingering on the softness of her lower lip. The desire was no longer a spark. It was a forest fire. The silence that followed was louder than the storm outside. I had her pinned against a mahogany table, my body a wall of heat and scars, and she didn't recoil. That was my undoing. I had spent years watching people flinch at the sight of me, but Clara looked at me as if she was seeing a miracle, not a monster. She was my maid, my duty, my sin. But in that moment, she was the only salvation I had ever known. I leaned in, my nose brushing against hers. I could feel the frantic gallop of her heart through the thin fabric of her bodice. It was a rhythmic invitation, a drumbeat calling me to a war I was more than willing to lose. I let my hand slide from her waist, my fingers splaying across her ribs, feeling the delicate architecture of her body. She was so small, so fragile in appearance, yet she possessed a strength that made my knees weak. "Do you have any idea?" I whispered, my voice sounding like gravel under a carriage wheel. "How many times I've imagined this? How many nights I've sat in that chair, drinking myself into a stupor just to drown out the thought of your skin." Clara's breath hitched. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of my neck, pulling me closer. "Then stop imagining, Arthur," she breathed. "I am here. I am real. And I am tired of being the only one who fights for you." I didn't wait for another word. I claimed her mouth with a desperation that was almost violent. It wasn't the polite kiss of a gentleman. It was a starved reclamation of a man who had been in the desert for a lifetime. She tasted of honey and defiance. Her mouth opened under mine, welcoming the invasion of my tongue with a soft, needy moan that vibrated directly into my soul. I hoisted her onto the table, her skirts bunching around her thighs. The friction of the wool against my trousers was a sweet agony. I broke the kiss to trail my lips down her throat, biting softly at the sensitive cord of her neck. She arched back, her head dropping, exposing the long, elegant line of her throat to the firelight. "Arthur, please," she whimpered. "Please, what, Clara?" I growled against her skin. "Please stop. I'll please never let you go." "The latter," she gasped, her nails digging into my shoulders. "Never let me go." I pulled back just enough to look at her. Her hair was coming undone, dark strands framing a face flushed with the passion I had ignited. I reached for the laces of her dress. My hands, usually so steady with a sword or a pen, were shaking. I wanted to see her. All of her. I wanted to know every inch of the woman who had dared to love a ghost. As I loosened the fabric, the cool air of the room hit her skin, making her nipples peek through the sheer linen of her chemise. The sight destroyed me. I lowered my head, my mouth finding the curve of her breast through the fabric, wetting it until the lace became transparent. Her gasp was sharp, her body jerking under my touch. "You are so beautiful," I confessed, the words tasting like a prayer. "I don't deserve to touch you. I don't deserve to breathe the same air." "You are the only man I want," she replied, her voice fierce. She began to tug at my shirt, pulling it from my trousers, her palms flat against the bare skin of my stomach. The contact was electric. I felt my muscles coil and tighten, my entire being focused on the sensation of her hands on me. We were teetering on the edge of a precipice. I knew that if I crossed this line, there was no going back to being master and servant. We would be bound by something far more permanent and far more dangerous than a contract of employment. But as she guided my hand to the junction of her thighs, feeling the damp heat through her undergarments, I realized I didn't care about the world. I didn't care about the ton, or my title, or the scars that marked my flesh. In this room, In this moment, I wasn't the beast above. I was a man, and she was the woman who had brought me back to life. I felt the slick warmth of her, a silent testimony to her own desire. The scent of her, pure, feminine, and aroused, filled my head until I couldn't think. I wanted to bury myself in her. I wanted to lose myself in the rhythm of a body until the shadows of my past were finally burned away by the light of a touch. The library was illuminated only by the dying embers of the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across Clara's skin. I had carried her from the table to the oversized leather sofa, never breaking the contact of our lips. My heart was thundering, a wild animal trapped in a cage of ribs, and for the first time in my life, I didn't want to calm it. I wanted to let it roar. She was my maid, my duty, my sin. But as I knelt between her thighs, she was my everything. I stripped away the loss of my pride along with my shirt, exposing the full extent of the damage the world had done to me. I waited for the flash of pity. I waited for her to turn her head. Instead, Clara reached out, her palms flat against my chest. She leaned forward and kissed a larger scar on my shoulder, her lips soft, lingering, and utterly transformative. "You are not a monster, Arthur," she whispered against my skin. "You are a masterpiece of survival." Those words destroyed the last of my defenses. I lowered her back onto the cushions, my body following Hayes, the weight of me pressing her into the soft leather. I moved slowly, savoring the friction of our skin. I wanted her to feel every inch of the man she had reclaimed. I began to kiss my way down her body, my tongue tracing the valley between her breasts, the curve of her stomach, until I heard her breath hitch in that specific, jagged way that told me she was mine. The first time I tasted her, she cried out my name, her fingers tangling in my hair, pulling me closer. The scent of her was intoxicating, like musk and wildflowers. I was relentless, driven by a desire that had been suppressed for too long. I wanted to memorize the sound of her whimpers, the way her thighs trembled against my ears, the way she arched her back when I found the center of her pleasure. "Arthur, I can't," she gasped, her voice breaking. "You can," I growled, looking up at her, my eyes dark with a hunger that was finally being fed. "Look at me, Clara. Look at what you do to me." When I finally moved to join our bodies, I paused at the threshold. I wanted this to be more than just a release. I wanted it to be a vow. I entered her slowly, an inch at a time, watching her eyes. I saw the moment of slight pain, then the widening of her pupils as pleasure took its place. She was tight, warm, and perfect. "Clara," I groaned, the name of prayer on my lips. She wrapped her legs around my waist, pulling me deeper, her body welcoming me home. We moved together in a rhythm as old as time, a slow, deliberate dance of heat and soul. Every thrust was confession, every gasp was a promise. I watched the way the firelight played over her features, the sweat on her brow, the flush on her cheeks, the sheer, unadulterated beauty of her surrender. It was an explosion of the senses. When the end came, it was a blinding white light that shattered the darkness of the last 3 years. I collapsed against her, my face buried in the crook of her neck, my breath coming in ragged, uneven boasts. I felt her heart beating against mine, a steady, triumphant throb. We stayed like that for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the rain against the glass. I realized then that the beast had not been tamed by a spell or miracle. He had been tamed by a woman who looked at his scars and saw only strength. I was no longer a ghost in my own house. I was alive, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the morning. The aftermath of that night was not filled with the shame I had expected, but with a clarity that was almost blinding. The dawn broke over the hills of Somerset, painting the sky in hues of soft violet and gold. For the first time in years, I did not hide when the sun touched the windows. I stayed in the warmth of the bed, watching the rise and fall of Clara's shoulders as she slept. She was my maid, my duty, my sin. But as the light filled the room, the labels the world used seemed like whispers from a distant, irrelevant past. She had seen the beast and had not only stayed, she had loved him. When she finally stirred, her eyes finding mine in the morning light, there was no hesitation. She reached out, her hand finding its home against my scarred cheek. I realized then that I was no longer a man who needed to be saved. I was a man who had been found. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small but steady. I took her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Now," I said, my voice thick with a certainty I had never felt before, "I stop pretending that this house is a tomb, and I stop pretending that you are anything less than the mistress of my heart." The scandal would be immense, of course. The Duke of Ashworth marrying his housekeeper would keep the tongue gossiping for a decade. But as I looked at her, I knew their whispers would never reach us. We had built a world in the shadows that was stronger than anything they could create in their bright, hollow ballrooms. I gave up the ghost of the man I used to be. I buried the beast of Bath in the library that night, leaving him behind in the embers of the fire. I became something new, a man who knew the value of a scar and the infinite power of a woman's touch. Sometimes, late at night, when the rain hits the windows just right, I pull her close and remember the silence that used to live here. I remember the cold, the scotch, and the jagged edges of my own soul. Then I feel her heart beating against mine, and I realize that the greatest victory of my life wasn't on a battlefield, but in the quiet surrender of a library. I used to believe I could control everything, until the night she looked back at me, and I thank God every day that I was wrong. For it wasn't my strength that saved me, but her softness. The monster is gone. Only the man remains, and he belongs, body and soul, to her. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It truly helps us bring you more tales of love, betrayal, and destiny. And if your heart still craves more, explore the other stories waiting for you here. You might just find your next obsession.